Eli arrived in Bighorn Flats, Wyoming, on a Tuesday. The stagecoach spat him out into a cloud of alkali dust that choked him and settled like fine gray flour on the shoulders of his only suit. He stood for a moment, carpetbag in hand, feeling the wind push against him. It was a wind that had not stopped blowing for 1,000 miles, and it carried the scent of pine and horse manure, and something ancient and cold. The town was little more than a single muddy street carved into the vast, brown landscape. False-fronted buildings of raw lumber stood shoulder to shoulder. A saloon, a land office, a livery, and Mortimer's general store. Horses lined the hitching posts, their tails switching at flies, their heads low. Men in dusty hats watched him from the shade of the saloon's porch, their faces hard and unreadable. Eli looked down. He always looked down. It was easier to count the cracks in the boardwalk than to meet a stranger's gaze. He felt the familiar pull in his left leg as he put weight on it. The club foot, the mark of his shame, made his gait a clumsy rhythm of step and drag. Step and drag. Mr. Mortimer. A thin man with a stained waistcoat and a perpetually worried expression, had hired him by letter. He needed a clerk who could read and write and cipher, and who would work for $12 a month plus a room above the store. Eli was desperate. Mr. Mortimer, upon seeing Eli's limp, had sighed. "You ain't much for hauling, are you, son?" "I can count, sir," Eli had whispered, his face burning. "I can keep the books. I write a clear hand." "Well, you're here." Mortimer had handed him an apron. "Sweep the floor. And the dust. God almighty, the dust." Eli's life settled into a routine of quiet dread. He woke before dawn, the air in his small room so cold he could see his breath. He would light the lamp, his spectacles fogging, and read a single verse from the Bible his father had packed for him. He would read it, his lips moving silently, trying to find the piety and not the poetry. Then he would go downstairs. He swept. He dusted cans of peaches and tins of coffee. He sorted mail. He weighed out pounds of flour and beans, his hands trembling slightly when a customer watched. He was small, frail, and 21 years old, though most guessed him to be nearer 30, or perhaps a sickly 16. His world shrank to the smell of tobacco, leather, vinegar, and soap. He avoided eye contact as if it were a physical blow. When Mrs. Davies, the smith's wife, came in for thread, he would look at her chin and murmur. When the cowhands, loud and smelling of whiskey and sweat, came for ammunition, he would look at the floor. "Look at the parson's boy," one of them had sneered one afternoon. "Afraid to look a man in the face." Eli had felt the blood rush to his cheeks. He fumbled the change, dropping a nickel. It rolled under the counter. "Leave him be, Jed," another man said, not unkindly. "He's broke, is all." They pitied him or they mocked him. He did not know which was worse. Pity felt like being stroked by a dirty hand. Mockery was the old, familiar sting of the schoolyard, the burn of his father's disappointment. He was the preacher's boy, sent west in disgrace. He had been caught, not with a woman, not with whiskey. His father, the Reverend Silas Miller, a man who saw sin in sunlight and damnation in a smile, had found him reading. It was not the Bible. It was a slim volume of poetry, slipped from a parishioner's library. He had been reading it by candlelight in his room, his lips forming the words of a love poem, feeling a strange, hollow ache in his chest. His father had not yelled. He had gone quiet, a terrible, cold quiet that was worse than any rage. "You are filled with weakness," Silas had said, his voice a razor. "You harbor softness. You walk with a crippled foot, and you nurse a crippled soul. The flesh is a temptation. Eli, you invite it in." He had taken the book and burned it in the stove. 2 weeks later, Eli was on the stagecoach to Wyoming, a place his father called God's Anvil, a place to have the weakness hammered out of him. Eli, however, just wanted to be invisible. He ate his meals of cold bread and cheese in his room. He attended church on Sunday, sitting in the back pew, his head bowed, hearing his father's sermons echo in the frontier preacher's plain speech. He did not go to the saloon. He did not go to the town socials. He was a ghost in spectacles, stacking shelves. Then, one afternoon in late October, she appeared. It was not her arrival that he noticed first, but the silence that fell upon the street. The lazy hammering from the smithy stopped. The men on the saloon porch went quiet. Eli, who was sorting through a crate of harnesses, looked up through the store's dusty front window. Two horses, wild-eyed and skittish, a paint and a buckskin, stood in the middle of the street. They were mustangs, unbroken, their manes tangled. Holding their lead ropes was a figure that Eli, for a moment, mistook for a man. The person was tall, taller than any man in Bighorn Flats, 6 foot, maybe 6'1", with shoulders that strained the seams of a worn, stained duster. Worn trousers, slick with grime and horse sweat, were tucked into heavy boots. A low-brimmed hat shadowed the face. The figure turned, and Eli saw it was a woman. She moved with a long, slow stride, pulling the horses toward the livery. She did not look at the staring faces. People moved out of her way. She was not just tall. She was built, muscular. Her hands, wrapped around the ropes, were large and scarred. She spoke to the livery owner, her voice too low for Eli to hear, but the owner shook his head. She stood there for a long moment, the horses stamping and pulling. Then she spat in the dust. She tied the horses to the rail, stroked the buckskin's nose, and turned. She was looking for work. Eli could see it in the way she scanned the street, her eyes moving over the land office, the saloon, the hotel. Her gaze passed over the general store, and for a second, Eli felt seen. He ducked back behind the counter, his heart hammering. A few minutes later, the bell above the store door jingled violently. Eli was alone. Mr. Mortimer was at the land office, arguing about a freight bill. Eli stood up from behind the counter, wiping his palms on his apron. She filled the doorway. The afternoon sun, streaming in behind her, made her a massive silhouette. She stepped inside, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. She took off her hat, revealing a tangle of dark hair, streaked with sweat, and a face that was all angles and planes. There was a thin white scar that ran from her temple to her jaw. She was not pretty. She was vast. Eli stared, unable to move. She was everything his father had preached against. She was disorder. She was strength where there should be softness. She was dirt and power. Can I? He stammered, his voice a dry squeak. Help! He backed away, his weak foot catching on the leg of a display table. He stumbled backward into a shelf of canned goods, a single glass jar of pickled peaches, stacked in a pyramid, wobbled. Eli lunged for it, his hands clumsy. He missed. The jar smashed on the floorboards, a spray of glass and sticky yellow syrup. Eli froze. The smell of vinegar and cinnamon filled the air. He felt a heat so profound it threatened to stop his heart. He was going to be sick. He was clumsy. He was weak. He was a fool. I'm... He dropped to his knees, grabbing at the large pieces of glass, heedless of the edges. He cut his finger, a bright bead of blood welling up, but he barely noticed. The woman just watched him. She did not laugh. She did not sigh in annoyance. She just stood there, her presence sucking the air from the room. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, rough, like gravel dredged from a riverbed. Saddle soap. Eli looked up, confused. He was kneeling in syrup, his hand bleeding. What? Saddle soap, she repeated, patience in her voice, but no kindness, just a flat statement of need. Oh, yes, aisle 3, he pointed, his hand shaking. By the ropes. She did not wait for him to get up. She walked past him, her heavy boots sticking slightly in the spilled syrup. Eli watched her go. She found the tin of soap, came back to the counter, and placed a silver dollar on the wood. It was worn smooth. The change! Eli struggled to his feet, his leg aching. The jar was 10 cents. But she was already walking out. She did not look back. The bell jingled. The door closed. Eli was left alone, shaking, his hand bleeding, the smell of vinegar burning his nose. He had never felt so small. The rumors started before sundown. Eli heard them as he swept up the glass, his hands still trembling. "Did you see the size of it?" said a rancher, buying tobacco. "They say she's half Indian, half grizzly." "I heard she killed a man in Laramie," his friend muttered. "Broke his back with her bare hands. Mortimer ought not to let that in the store. It ain't decent." The children, cruel in the way only children can be, found a name for her. As she walked her horses to the creek, they darted from behind a rain barrel, yelling in a high sing-song, man, woman, too big to be a bride." She did not turn her head. She just kept walking. Eli learned her name was Sadie. She had gotten work, not at the livery, but mending fences for old man Hemphill, who owned the ranch bordering the town. She was not welcome at the hotel, and the boarding house matron had taken one look at her and slammed the door. She was sleeping in Hemphill's barn. From the store window, Eli watched her. He had a clear view of the north pasture where she worked. She worked like a machine. She did not rest. She dug post holes in the hard, dry ground. She lifted beams that Eli knew took 2, sometimes 3, men to carry. She would stop, wipe her face on her sleeve, drink from a canteen, and begin again. She never spoke to anyone. No one spoke to her. She was an island of solitary, muscular effort. One afternoon, a week after she had arrived, Eli was watching her wrestle with a roll of new barbed wire. It was tangled, stubborn. He saw her brace her boot against a post and pull, her muscles bunching under her shirt. The wire snapped free suddenly. He saw her flinch. She dropped the wire. She stood very still for a moment, looking at her hand. Even from this distance, Eli could see the dark stain spreading. She had cut herself, badly. Sadie looked at the cut. She looked back toward the town. Then she deliberately wrapped her bandana around the wound, picked up the wire, and went back to work. She worked for another hour, the sky turning purple with dusk, before she finally walked off the field, her left hand held stiffly at her side. Eli was stacking the last of the flour sacks when the bell jingled. It was her. She looked exhausted. There was grime on her face, and her shirt was dark with sweat. She walked to the counter and put down a can of beans and a pouch of tobacco. Her left hand, wrapped in the filthy, blood-soaked bandana, she kept at her side. Eli looked at the hand. The cloth was dripping. A small, dark puddle was forming on the floor. He was terrified, but the sight of the blood, and the memory of her working for an hour while bleeding, stirred something else in him. Something beneath the fear. That's a bad cut, ma'am," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. Sadie glanced at her hand as if just remembering it. She shrugged, her massive shoulders lifting. "It'll heal. It'll fester," Eli said, surprising himself. "With the rust and the dirt, you have to clean it." She looked at him. Her eyes were brown, with flecks of green, and they were as tired as the hills. "You a doctor?" No." His heart was pounding. He could feel the stutter fighting to take over his throat. "But my mother, she was sick a long time. I used to help with bandages." He made a decision. It felt like stepping off a cliff. He ducked under the counter, his hands searching. He found the brown bottle of carbolic acid and a roll of clean cotton bandages. He grabbed a clean rag from a bundle. He stood up. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. Please," Eli said, holding out the bottle. "Let me. It won't cost nothing." Sadie stared at the bottle, then at his face. He was sure she would laugh, or shove him aside and leave. He saw her jaw tighten. She seemed to be having an argument with herself. Slowly, deliberately. She put her left hand on the counter. "Go on, then," she grunted. Eli's hands were shaking so badly he could barely untie the knot on the bandana. It was caked with drying blood and dirt. He finally pulled it free, and he had to stop himself from gasping. The cut was long, from the heel of her palm almost to her wrist. It gaped open, the edges raw, It was filled with dirt, rust flakes from the wire, and tiny splinters of wood from the fence post. This is going to hurt," he whispered. "Just do it." He poured the carbolic directly into the wound. Sadie hissed, a sharp intake of breath. Her entire body went rigid. Her free hand clenched into a fist so tight the knuckles went white, but she did not pull away. Eli, his spectacles sliding down his nose, leaned closer. "I have to get the dirt out." He took the rag and, his stomach churning, began to dab at the cut, cleaning the edges. He was terrified, but a strange focus settled over him. He was no longer the store clerk. He was just a pair of hands, doing a job that needed doing. "Hold still." He found tweezers under the counter. He pushed his spectacles back up. He leaned in, his face close to her hand, and began to pick out the splinters, one by one. She flinched at every touch, a small, sharp movement, but she held steady. He worked for 5 minutes. The store was utterly silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock and the sharp click of the tweezers. He was concentrating so hard, he forgot to be afraid of her. He forgot her size. He forgot the rumors. He was just focused on the wound, on the skin, on the blood. When he was done, he poured a little more carbolic to wash it clean. He took the clean cotton and began to wrap her hand. His fingers brushed her calloused skin, which felt rough as wood but warm. He wrapped it tightly, neatly, the way his mother had taught him. He tied the knot. He finished. He looked at his work. The white bandage was stark against her brown, dirty skin. There," he said. He finally looked up. She was staring at him, not at his hands, but at his face. Her gaze was level, intense, and it pinned him. He realized he was looking right back at her. He was meeting her eyes. He had not stuttered. He pulled back, his face instantly hot with a blush. That should hold it." Sadie did not look at her hand. She just kept looking at him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as wool. She spoke, and her voice was not the gravel he had heard before. It was softer, rough, yes, but low and filled with a strange quiet. "Ain't nobody ever looked me in the eye like that before." She put the coin for the beans and tobacco on the counter. This time, she waited as Eli, his hands shaking again, counted out her change. She took the coins, picked up her goods, and walked out. That night, Eli lay in his narrow cot, the wind whistling around the eaves of the store. He could not sleep. He kept seeing her hand, the raw cut, the dirt. He kept feeling the strange, quiet focus that had settled on him. He dreamed, but his dreams were not of the shame he felt when he dropped the jar. They were not of the fear he felt when she first walked in. He dreamed of her eyes. He dreamed of the silence in the store, of the steady way she had watched him, unflinching as he cleaned her wound. He woke long before dawn, his body rigid, a strange and unfamiliar warmth low in his belly. He felt a profound pull, a confusing hunger, and then, immediate and cold, the shame crashed over him. He heard his father's voice. "The flesh is a gateway to damnation. You harbor softness." He had looked at a woman who was unnatural, a brute, a creature of dirt and strength, and he had not felt repulsion. He had felt something else. He got out of bed, his limp heavy in the darkness, and splashed icy water on his face from the basin. He was weak. He was a sinner. He was just like his father said. Miles away, in the cold darkness of Hemphill's barn, Sadie sat leaned against a bale of hay. The horses stamped and snorted in their stalls. She opened the can of beans with her knife and ate them cold, using the knife as a spoon. She stopped, the can halfway to her mouth. She looked down at her bandaged hand. The white cotton was clean under the moonlight streaming through the hayloft door. It did not throb as much. She looked out toward the town. The saloon was still bright, spilling yellow light and the sound of a tinny piano onto the street. From the hotel, a man and a woman walked out, arm in arm. The woman laughed, a high, bright sound, and leaned her head on the man's shoulder. Sadie looked away. She looked at her boots. She looked at the horse in the nearest stall. "I ain't made for softness," she muttered to the horse. The horse just blinked, chewing hay. Sadie finished her beans, wiped the knife on her trousers, and closed her eyes, trying to find sleep. The bandage Eli had tied was stiff with dried blood, but the cut beneath was clean. Sadie returned 3 days later, her hand held awkwardly. She bought another can of beans and slid the wrapped hand onto the counter. "It needs changin'," she said, not as a request, but as a fact. Eli, his hand steadier this time, fetched the carbolic and a new roll of cotton. He unwrapped the wound. The skin was puckered and red, but the angry swelling had gone down. It was healing. He cleaned it again, the sting of the acid making her wince, but she held still. He wrapped it, his fingers moving with a new, quiet confidence. "Mister, Hemphill is done with me," she said to the counter. "Fences are mended." Eli finished the knot. What will you do? Ride on, find another ranch?" She flexed her bandaged fingers. "Always another fence." Eli looked around the store. It was quiet, the mid-morning lull. Mr. Mortimer was in his office, groaning over the freight ledgers. A shipment of flour and salted pork was due, and his usual man, Silas, was down with a fever. "Mr. Mortimer needs help," Eli said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "The new app freight, it's heavy." Sadie looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "He wouldn't hire me. He needs the strong back more than he dislikes the talk." It was the longest sentence Eli had spoken to her, and it came out with only 2 stutters. He blushed, but held her gaze. Sadie considered this. She looked at her wrapped hand, then at the back room where the sacks of flour were stored. Mr. Mortimer, when Eli proposed it, looked as if Eli had suggested hiring a grizzly bear. "Her?" he squeaked, his waistcoat seeming to shrink. That giant? She'll scare off every paying customer I have. Eli." "She's strong, sir," Eli insisted, his voice low. "She dug all of Mr. Hemphill's post holes in 2 days. Silas will be sick for a week, and those barrels won't move themselves. You can pay her for the day. Cheaper than letting the flour mildew on the dock." Mortimer pulled at his collar. He was a man who understood profit and loss better than he understood fear. He looked out the window at Sadie, who was standing by the hitching post, patient as a stone. He looked at the empty storeroom. 10 cents an hour, he muttered. "And she uses the back door. And she don't talk to the clientele. God help me." Sadie's employment at Mortimer's general store began that afternoon. She did not use the back door. She walked in the front, and the 2 ladies examining bolts of calico took one look at her, gathered their skirts, and fled. Mortimer closed his eyes and looked, for a moment, like he might weep. But when the freight wagon arrived, Mortimer's expression changed. The driver, a barrel-chested man named Al, dropped a 100-pound sack of flour onto the dock with a grunt. Sadie walked up, lifted a sack onto her right shoulder, and grabbed another with her left arm. She carried them both into the storeroom as if they were feed bags. Al, the driver, stared, his mouth open. She made the trip 4 times, clearing the wagon in 10 minutes, a job that usually took Al and Silas the better part of an hour. Mortimer stopped wringing his hands. He started calculating. Her work became part-time, but regular. She came in 3 days a week, during the busy freight hours, to unload wagons and stock the high shelves. Her presence changed the air in the store. Men still came in, but they spoke quieter. The cowhands who used to spit tobacco juice near the stove now took their chews outside. Women, when they came, did their business quickly, their eyes darting toward the tall figure in the back, stacking crates of tinned milk. Sadie rarely spoke. She worked. She was a silent, powerful machine. Eli's world, however, had cracked open. He was no longer the only person in Bighorn Flats who did not fit. He took to bringing her a cup of coffee from the pot-bellied stove in the mid-afternoon. He would carry it to the back room, his hands shaking. Thank you," she would grunt, taking the tin cup from him. Her hands, he saw, were not just scarred, but webbed with old calluses. One day, he found her staring at the wall, "Why'd you do it?" she asked, her voice startling him. Do what? Help me with my hand? Then the job." She turned to him. "They all think I'm a freak." "You do too." It was not a question. Eli looked at his shoes. The leather was scuffed. I know what it's like to be looked at." Sadie snorted, a short, sharp sound. "Because of that foot? That's nothing. That's just a broken piece. I'm wrong. All the way through." "No," Eli said, his voice small but clear. "You're not." She looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face. She seemed to find something there, or maybe she just got tired of looking. She turned back to her coffee. A strange friendship, thin as spider silk, began to spin between them. It was built in the silence of the storeroom, over the scent of burlap and coffee and dust. She began to tease him. It was a rough, dry humor, like her voice. One morning, he was trying to use the long pole to retrieve a tin of coffee from the top shelf, his bad foot making him wobble. "Careful, Parsons' boy," she said, walking up behind him. "You fall. You'll break. You're all twigs and spectacles." Eli blushed. "I can get it." "Sure you can." She reached up, her arm extending to its full, long length, and plucked the tin from the shelf with her bare hand. She dropped it into his apron. "Don't strain yourself." He looked up at her, expecting the familiar sting of mockery, but her eyes, though stern, held no malice. He found himself smiling, a small, rusty smile. "Thank you, ma'am." "Sadie," she corrected him. "Ma'am is for old women in bonnets." He started to laugh. It was a choked, unfamiliar sound, like a pump that hadn't drawn water in a season. But it was a laugh. The incident with the barrel happened a week later. It was a cask of salted pork, thick oak bound with iron, weighing well over 200 pounds. It had been delivered to the wrong spot, and Mortimer wanted it moved to the cellar. Eli, feeling the unfamiliar warmth of his own laughter still in his chest, decided he would move it. He wanted to show he did not know who, her, himself, that he was not just twigs and spectacles. He squared himself, braced his good leg, and shoved. The barrel did not move. He tried again, grunting, his face turning a deep, painful red. He put his shoulder to it, his bad foot slipping on the dusty floor. The barrel rocked, just an inch, and settled back. He was gasping, sweat stinging his eyes, the old, familiar shame washing over him. He was weak. He was useless. "You're gonna bust a seam, Eli?" He froze, his shoulders still pressed against the wood. Sadie was standing in the storeroom doorway, wiping her hands on a rag. I have it," he panted, stepping back, humiliated. "Sure." She walked past him. She didn't look at him. She looked at the barrel. She spat on her hands, rubbed them together, and found her grip on the iron bands. She bent her knees, her back straight. "You lift with your legs," she muttered, as if to herself. She took a deep breath and lifted. Eli watched. His breath caught in his throat. The barrel came off the floor. Her muscles bunched under her shirt, her arms trembling with the strain. Her face contorted with effort, a low grunt escaping her lips. But she did not falter. She held it steady, took 2 steps, and set it down on the cellar dolly with a heavy, solid thud. She stood up, breathing hard, and wiped her forehead with her sleeve. Eli just stared. He was mortified. His failure was complete, but beneath the shame, a hotter, stranger feeling was rising. It was admiration, so pure and sharp it almost hurt. He had never seen such strength. It was beautiful. "How?" he whispered. She shrugged, still catching her breath. "Just heavy." She looked at him, at his red face and his sweat-soaked collar. "You ain't built for it. Eli, no shame in it. Some folks are built to lift. Some are built to cipher." She walked away, leaving him standing there, his heart thumping, his world tilted slightly on its axis. That evening, as they were sweeping the floors before closing, he told her. He had not planned to. The words just came out. My father. He thinks I'm weak, crippled in soul. He says, same as my foot. Sadie stopped sweeping. She leaned on her broom, her gaze distant. Fathers. She said the word like it was a curse. He sent me here because I was reading poetry. Sadie looked at him. Poetry? A love poem. Eli whispered, the shame of it burning him again. He said I was soft, inviting sin. Sadie was quiet for a long moment. My PA, she said, her voice low and flat. Wanted a son. He got me. My ma died birthing me. I think he never forgave me for it. Eli watched her. She was staring at the unlit pot-bellied stove. He taught me to rope a steer for I could sew a stitch. She continued, her voice a monotone. Taught me how to break a horse, how to take a punch, how to shoot a rifle. By the time I was 13, I could drink him under the table. By 15, I could wrestle him to the ground. She paused, and her large, rough hand tightened on the broom handle. But he never once, not one time, he never once put his arm round me, never hugged me. Guess he figured I was too big to hold, or maybe I was just too much like him. She shook her head, as if to clear it. Fathers, she said again. They fill you with rocks and tell you to swim. She went back to sweeping, her movements sharp, and Eli watched her, a hollow, aching echo in his own chest. The storm came 2 nights later, a driving November gale that turned the street to mud and rattled the windows in their frames. It was past closing. Mortimer had gone home early, leaving Eli to lock up. Sadie had stayed late, helping him move the winter stock. They were in the back room, the only light coming from a single lantern hung on a nail. The wind howled outside, a high, lonely sound. Rain lashed the small, dirty window. Eli was on a stool, marking the inventory in the ledger. Sadie was standing by the window, watching the rain turn to sleet. This weather, she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the storm, makes a body feel small, like the world's trying to scrape you off of it. Eli nodded, his pencil still. It's loud. She turned from the window. The lantern light threw strange, long shadows across her face, softening the scar, deepening her eyes. She looked at him, not at his face, but at his mouth. You're a strange man, Eli, she said. He blushed. I'm just... You're quiet. You look at things. You ain't like the other men. They look at me and they see a mule or a monster. You just look... She took a step toward him. He stayed frozen on the stool. You ever been kissed, Eli? The question dropped into the small room like a stone. Eli's pencil slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. His face, his neck, his entire body went hot. He felt as if he had been plunged into boiling water. That's not a proper... Ain't a trick question, she said, her voice even softer. She took another step. She was close now. He could smell the lye soap from her skin, and leather, and the damp wool of her shirt. Yes or no. He could not speak. He could not lie. He stared at the floor, at his own boots, and gave a tiny, jerky shake of his head. No. He heard her boots shift on the floorboards. She was in front of him. He was on the stool, and she was standing, towering over him. He forced himself to look up. Her face was not hard. It was not teasing. It was curious, and something else, something he could not name. She was so close. He could feel the warmth coming from her. He saw the flecks of green in her brown eyes. She lifted her hand, the one that was scarred, and slowly, as if not sure of the movement, she reached toward his face. Clang, jangle, bang! A fist hammered on the front door of the store. Mortimer, open up! I need whiskey, damn you! It's cold as a witch's heart out here. The moment shattered. Sadie's hand dropped. She flinched, as if struck, and stepped back. Her face hardened, the softness vanishing, replaced by the familiar, weary mask. Go! She grunted, her voice rough again. See to him? Eli, his hands trembling so hard he could barely stand, slid off the stool. He fumbled for his keys, his legs weak. He went to the front, unlocked the door, and sold the bottle of whiskey to the half-drunk rancher. His mind a total blank. When he came back to the storeroom, she was gone. The lantern was still lit, swinging slightly in a draft. But Sadie had slipped out into the storm. That night, Sadie lay in the cold hay of the barn, the wind screaming outside. She was not cold. She was burning. She touched her own lips with her fingers. What had she been doing? What had she been thinking? He was a man, a small, weak, trembling man, a parson's boy, afraid of his own shadow. But he had looked at her, he had seen her, and for a second, a strange, terrifying impulse had taken her. The thought of his mouth, his red face, his shy eyes. It made her chest feel tight, a dull, confusing ache. She was not soft. She hated softness. She punched the hay bale, hard. Eli, in his narrow room above the store, lit his lamp. His hands would not stop shaking. He sat on his cot for a long time, listening to the rain. He opened his journal. He wanted to write about it. He wanted to write about her face, her eyes, the feeling of her standing so close. But his father's words were loud in his head. Damnation, sin, softness. He dipped his pen, but he could not write about the kiss that almost was. Instead, he wrote, "Her hands. They are not like a lady's hands. They are scarred and strong." Today she lifted the pork barrel. It was a terrible weight, but she was not rough. Her voice, they say it is rough as gravel. But tonight, in the storm, it was quiet as the rain. He closed the book, blew out the lamp, and lay in the dark, trembling. The confrontation came 3 days later. The store was busy. The first sunny afternoon after the storm. Eli was at the counter, measuring out coffee beans for Mrs. Davies. Sadie was in the back, stacking the last of the tinned goods on the high shelves. The door banged open, and Jedediah Stokes and 2 of his friends staggered in. They were the same cowhands who had mocked Eli his first week. They were loud, half-drunk, and spoiling for a fight. "Give me a bottle, Parson's boy," Jed slurred, banging a fist on the counter. Eli flinched. Good afternoon, Mr. Stokes. Whiskey or the strong stuff, and hurry it up." Jed's eyes scanned the store, and he saw Sadie. She was on a small ladder, her back to him, placing cans of peaches on a shelf. Her height, even on the ladder, made her seem immense. "Well, looky here," Jed sneered, his voice carrying through the store. "Mrs." Davies gathered her things and scurried out. "It's the bighorn giant." Sadie did not turn. She continued her work. "Heard you're Mortimer's pet now," one of his friends called out. "Haulin' his freight like a good little mule. I'd like to see her haul something else." Jed snickered, and his friends laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. Eli froze. His blood ran cold. "Please," he whispered, his voice shaking. Just take your bottle." Jed turned on him. "What's that, Parson's boy? You protecting your sweetheart? She your girl, Eli?" He laughed and took a step toward Sadie. "Hey, freak, why don't you do something useful and leave her be?" The words were out of Eli's mouth before he could think. They were thin, reedy, but they cut through the room. Jed stopped. He turned around, his face a mask of disbelief. "What did you say?" Eli, terrified but locked in place by a force he did not understand, stepped out from behind the counter. He stood between Jed and Sadie. "I said leave her be. She ain't bothering you." Jed stared. Then he roared with laughter. "Look at this. The little cripple's got a spine." He shoved Eli in the chest. "Get out of the way! Cripple, I'm talking to the thing!" He shoved him again, harder. Eli, unbalanced by his bad foot, stumbled backward. He crashed into a tall, rickety display of cast-iron pots and pans. The entire thing went over with a deafening crash. Eli landed hard on the floorboards, the breath knocked from his lungs. His spectacles flew from his face and skittered under a shelf. The store went utterly, deathly silent. Eli, gasping, on his hands and knees, heard a sound. It was not a yell. It was a low growl, like a wolf's. He fumbled for his glasses, his vision blurry. He saw Sadie. She had stepped off the ladder. She had risen to her full height, her hands clenched at her sides. Her face was a mask of cold, controlled, terrible fury. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. Her voice was deadly quiet. Jed, still drunk, puffed out his chest, but his smile faltered. "Or what? You bit—" He never finished the word. Sadie moved. She was not a clumsy giant. She was fast, like a panther. She did not punch him. She grabbed the front of Jed's thick canvas jacket with one hand, bunched the material in her fist, and lifted him. Jed's boots left the floor. His eyes went wide with shock. With a single, powerful grunt, Sadie threw him. Jed flew backward, not stumbling, but airborne. He crashed directly into the tall, neatly stacked pyramid of canned goods, the very shelves Sadie had been stocking. The structure collapsed. Jed disappeared under an avalanche of tinned peaches, beans, and corn. He landed in a heap, groaning, a stream of peach syrup spreading across the floor. His two friends stood frozen, their face chalk white. Sadie took one step toward them, her hands still clenched. They turned and bolted from the store as if the devil himself were after them. The aftermath was swift. Mr. Mortimer ran out of his office, his face ashen. Sheriff Hart, a weary man with a drooping mustache, arrived moments later, drawn by the crash. "She's a menace! A danger!" Mortimer shrieked, pointing at the sticky, groaning pile of man and cans. "Look at my store! Look at it!" The sheriff looked at Jed, who was being helped up, his arm hanging at a strange angle. He looked at the ruined shelves. He looked at Eli, who had found his spectacles. One lens was cracked down the middle and was getting to his feet, his lips split and bleeding. Finally, he looked at Sadie. She was standing perfectly still, breathing evenly, her face calm and cold. "Sadie," the sheriff said, his voice heavy. "You can't be doing this. I don't care what he said. You can't be throwing men through my town. This is your one and only warning. Next time, it's the cell. You understand me?" Sadie just nodded once, her eyes flat and empty. The sheriff and Mortimer dragged the moaning, syrupy cowhand out of the store, the street filled with curious onlookers. Eli and Sadie were left alone in the wreckage. The store was a disaster. The air smelled of vinegar, tin, and sweet syrup. Eli, his hands shaking, put on his cracked spectacles. The world was now split in two. He walked over to her. He had to crane his neck to look up at her. He was bruised. His leg ached from the fall. His lip was bleeding. "Thank you," he whispered. Sadie looked down at him. The cold fury was gone from her eyes. It was replaced by something old and deep and terribly weary. She reached out. Her large, rough hand, the one he had bandaged, came up. He thought she might pat his shoulder. Instead, her fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed his cheek. She did not touch his cut lip, but her thumb grazed his jawline, a touch so light it was barely there. "Nobody's ever stood up for me before," she said. Her voice was rough, and for a fleeting second, Eli thought it cracked, but then she blinked. The moment passed. She dropped her hand, turned away from him, and picked up a fallen broom from the aisle. "Best clean this up," she grunted, her back to him. "Mortimer'll take it from your pay." The day Sadie threw Jedediah Stokes through the tinned goods shelf was the last day anyone in Bighorn Flats pretended to be civil. Before, she had been a curiosity, a whispered rumor. Now, she was a monster. The story, told and retold in the saloon and over clotheslines, grew with every telling. She hadn't just thrown him, she had lifted him 6 feet in the air with one hand. She hadn't just broken his arm, she had nearly twisted it from his socket. The town did not just turn on Sadie, it turned on Eli. He was her defender, her something. The word they used was puppet. He felt the change when he went to Sunday service, as he always did. His lip was still swollen, the crack in his spectacles mended with a clumsy dab of pine resin. He sat in his usual spot, the back pew, but the space around him, usually filled by families with small children, remained empty. He was an island. The whispers were not about him this time, but they were for him. He heard Mrs. Davies hiss to her husband. He sits in the Lord's house, marked by her violence. After the sermon, a sermon on the wickedness that wears familiar flesh. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, a stern woman with a face like dried leather, waylaid him at the door. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice low and sharp. "My husband and I are concerned, deeply concerned." "Ma'am," Eli looked at his shoes, "we know of your father, a good man, a godly man. He sent you here to be strengthened, to be hardened against temptation." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "This creature, this woman, she is a force of chaos. She is an unnatural thing. The town is afraid, and you, Eli, you are stained by her. She was defending me," Eli whispered, his face burning. "She broke a man's arm, Mr. Miller. There is no defense for that. You are walking a dark path. The congregation prays for your soul, but we must insist you stay away from her, for your own good, and for the peace of this town." He limped away from the church, the familiar shame of his father's sermons twisting in his gut. But this time, it was different. It was mixed with a low, burning anger. They hadn't seen Jed's face. They hadn't heard what he said. The hostility was not just in whispers. It was plain as day. Sadie still had work at the store, but Mr. Mortimer had cut her hours to almost nothing, just an hour or two in the early morning, handling freight before the customers arrived. He docked her pay, and Eli's, for the damages to the shelves. Eli did not care about the money. One afternoon, Sadie went to the smithy. The buckle on her duster had broken. Eli watched from the store window as she approached Mr. Davies. He saw Davies shake his head, his arms crossed. He saw Sadie say something, holding out the metal buckle. Davies pointed a finger, not at her, but at the street, telling her to leave. She came back to the store, her face set like cold iron. He wouldn't help?" Eli asked, his voice low. Sadie went to the storeroom, her sanctuary, and began to stack crates with a controlled, quiet violence. "He said he doesn't serve my kind." "What kind?" She slammed a crate of lye soap onto a shelf. "The kind that scares his wife, the kind that don't know its place." She stood still for a long time, her back to him, staring at the raw lumber of the wall. Eli, cleaning his cracked spectacles, a task he now did a dozen times a day, just waited. "Wherever I go." "Eli," she said, her voice a low, rough rumble. "I'm wrong. If I'm quiet, I'm strange. If I work like a man, I'm a mule. If I fight, I'm a brute. There ain't no place for me to just be." "I know," he whispered. And he did. He, with his limping foot and his stuttering tongue, knew exactly what it felt like to be wrong. The tension stretched for 3 more days. The air in Bighorn Flats was thick and sour. Eli felt the stares every time he stepped outside. He was the freak's pet. He was the cripple who consorted with the giant. Then the rain came. It started as a cold drizzle in the afternoon and, by nightfall, had turned into a driving, icy downpour. The wind howled, rattling the store's windows. Mr. Mortimer had left early, eager to be by his own fire, leaving Eli to lock up. He finished tallying the day's meager earnings, his fingers stiff with cold. He blew out the main lamps, leaving just one lantern burning by the door. He put on his coat, preparing for the miserable, muddy walk to his room above the store. When he opened the front door, the wind almost tore it from his hand, and he saw her. Sadie was standing under the narrow overhang, sheltering from the worst of the rain. She was soaked. Water dripped from the brim of her hat and ran in rivulets down her duster. "Sadie, what are you doing here?" "Waitin'," she grunted. "You'll catch your death." He looked up and down the muddy, empty street. "You shouldn't wait for me. They'll talk." "They're already talkin'," she said. "Talkin's all they do." He locked the door. The sound of the key in the lock was unnaturally loud. He pulled his hat down. Let me walk you to the barn. Ain't your keeper, Eli? I know. He just started walking, his limp more pronounced in the thick, sucking mud. She fell into step beside him. They didn't speak. The only sound was the roar of the wind, the lash of the rain, and the squelch of their boots. The town was dark. Every window was shuttered against them, against the storm. It felt as if they were the only two people left in the world. They reached the livery, the huge dark shape of the barn looming before them. It offered shelter, the scent of hay and horseflesh. They stopped just inside the massive doorway, out of the direct rain but not out of the cold. The wind whistled through the cracks in the boards. Eli shivered, pulling his thin coat tighter. You'll be all right in the hayloft." Sadie didn't answer. She took off her hat, slapping it against her thigh, sending a spray of water into the dark. Her hair was plastered to her head. She looked at him. Her face, in the deep gloom, was all shadows and angles, but her eyes looked lost. "You ever wonder what it is like, Eli?" she asked, her voice thick, almost lost in the storm. "Wonder what?" "To just be held." He froze. His heart, which had been pounding from the cold, seemed to stop. "Not grabbed," she said, her voice rough with a strange emotion. "Not pushed or shoved, just held, like you're worth something, like you're worth keeping dry." He looked at her. She was a giant. She was the strongest person he had ever known, and she looked, in that moment, as small and as breakable as he felt. He heard his father's voice in his head. Temptation, damnation, unnatural. But he also saw the woman who had taken a warning for him, the woman who had been refused service, who had stood up for him, who had confessed that she was wrong everywhere she went. Eli was terrified. His hands were shaking, but he did something he never thought he could do. He nervously, awkwardly, lifted his arms. They felt heavy as lead. I don't know how," he whispered, his voice trembling. Sadie looked at his half-raised arms. A shudder went through her, a tremor he could see. She reached out, not to his arms, but to his hand. Her fingers, calloused and strong, closed around his. Her grip was not rough. It was just sure. "Come up," she said, her voice thick. "Out of the cold." She led him to the ladder. He climbed, his bad foot slipping once, but her hand was steady on his back. The hayloft was dark, but it was dry. The rain drummed on the roof, a frantic, steady rhythm. The air was sweet with the smell of dried clover and dust. A single shaft of moonlight, breaking through the storm clouds, cut through a gap in the roof and lit a small patch of the hay. They stood in the center of the loft, breathing, the sound of their breathing and the sound of the rain. "You're shivering," she said. "So are you," he whispered. She didn't let go of his hand. She turned to him, her height making him feel like a child, but her eyes were not looking down on him. They were just looking. She leaned in. Eli's entire body went rigid. He closed his eyes. This was it. This was the sin. This was the fall. Her lips touched his. It was not soft. Her lips were chapped, firm, and cold from the rain. It was hesitant, clumsy, a question. She tasted of rain and salt and leather. He did not move. He did not breathe. He just stood there, a small, trembling man, being kissed by a giant. Then he made a sound, a small, broken sigh that was half fear and half something else. His free hand, the one that wasn't holding hers, came up and, shaking violently, grabbed the sleeve of her duster. It was all the signal she needed. The hesitation shattered. The gentleness was gone. A lifetime of loneliness, of being too big, too strong, too wrong. A lifetime of rage and hunger and cold poured out of her. She kissed him. It was not a kiss from a poem. It was a drowning. Her other arm came around him, pulling him against her, and her strength was terrifying. She lifted him slightly, pulling him off balance, his bad foot coming off the floor. His head was spun. He was enveloped by her. Her mouth was fierce, hungry, desperate. Eli trembled so hard he thought his bones would break. He was overwhelmed. He was terrified. This was the abyss. This was the damnation his father had promised. But it was also the first time in his life he had ever been touched with need. Not with pity, not with mockery, not with disgust. It was pure, raw hunger. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He gripped her duster, his knuckles white, and kissed her back. He woke to the smell of hay and the gray, watery light of dawn. He was alone. For a moment, he was confused, his body stiff and aching in a way he had never known. He was in the hayloft. He was fully clothed, but his hair was full of hay and his coat was twisted beneath him. The memory of the night, of the rain, of her mouth, crashed over him. He sat up, his face burning. Sadie was gone. He heard her voice below, speaking low to the horses. He had spent the night in the barn with her. He scrambled to his feet, his leg aching, and fumbled for his spectacles. He looked a mess. His clothes were rumpled, stained with hay. He climbed down the ladder, his heart pounding a rhythm of pure, unadulterated panic. Sadie was in a stall, brushing the buckskin. She turned as he landed on the dirt floor. Her face was calm. She looked as she always did, but her eyes held a new, dark light. "Eli," she said, her voice level. I have to go," he stammered, his stutter back with a vengeance. "Mr. Mortimer, the store." He didn't wait for her reply. He practically ran from the barn, his limp making him stumble in the mud. He burst out onto the main street, his chest heaving, and he froze. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, was standing not 20 feet away, on the boardwalk, a basket on her arm. She was on her way to the mercantile. She saw him come out of the barn. Her eyes went wide. She looked at his disheveled clothes, his hay-filled hair. Her gaze flicked to the dark opening of the barn, then back to his terrified, guilty face. Her mouth formed a perfect, silent O of profound and complete horror. She said nothing. She gathered her skirts, turned, and walked away. Not toward the store, but toward the parsonage, her back rigid with righteous purpose. By the time Eli unlocked the store, the news was already spreading. He could feel it. The town was alive with it. The gossip exploded like gunpowder. The cripple and the giant, the parson's boy and the brute, in the barn, together. He was behind the counter, trying to sweep, his hands shaking so badly he kept dropping the broom. When Sadie walked in, Mr. Mortimer was waiting for her. He had been in his office, but he emerged as soon as he heard the bell. His face was pale, blotchy, and slick with sweat. He was shaking with rage. "Get out," he hissed. Sadie stopped. I have the freight to unload. Get out!" Mortimer pointed a trembling finger at the door. "I will not have a harlot, a degenerate, in my store. You are filth. You are a corruption. I warned you," he shrieked, turning on Eli. "I warned you about her. And now she has pulled you into her sin. Mr. Mortimer, please," Eli begged. "It was the rain. She is fired," Mortimer screamed, his voice cracking. "And you, Eli Miller, are one step from it. One more word for her, and you are out in the street with her." Eli looked at Sadie. Her face was stone. She had not flinched. She had not argued. She looked at Mortimer, then at Eli. Her eyes were empty, as if she had expected this, as if this was the only way it could ever be. She nodded once, slowly. She turned and walked out of the store. The bell tinkled softly behind her. Eli stood there, frozen, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. He found her in the barn an hour later. He had walked out of the store, ignoring Mortimer's sputtered threats. She was packing, her few belongings, a bedroll, a canteen, a spare shirt, her tin of saddle soap, were being rolled into her duster. "Sadie," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You best get back," she said, not looking at him. "He'll fire you." "I don't care." He walked toward her, his limp heavy. "It's my fault. What they're saying. I'm so sorry, Sadie. I shouldn't have. I shouldn't have stayed. It ain't your fault. Eli. She tied the bedroll with a piece of rawhide, her movements quick and efficient. It was mine. I knew better. I'm just wrong. I forgot for a minute. Don't say that. It's true. She slung the roll over her shoulder. I'll be gone by noon. Where will you go? West, over the mountains, California, maybe the ocean, someplace big enough to get lost in. Footsteps, heavy and official, sounded on the dirt floor. Not going anywhere. Sadie. It was Deputy Pike. He was young, with a cruel mouth and an oversized badge. He was holding a warrant. You're under arrest, Pike said, enjoying the moment. Sadie's hand, which had been reaching for her saddle, froze. For what? Mortimer fired me. I'm leaving. Not for that, Pike sneered. For aggravated assault. Jed Stokes. Doctor says his arm is broke in 2 places. Bad break. He might not get the use of it back, and Sheriff Hart don't take kindly to his warning being ignored. He pushed Eli, Eli shouted, stepping forward. He called her a freak. Quiet, cripple, Pike said, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. This ain't your concern. He looked back at Sadie. Now, put your hands behind your back, ma'am. Real slow. Sadie looked at Pike. She looked at the warrant. She looked at Eli, his terrified, pale face. And then she looked at the small, barred window of the town jail, which she could see from the barn door. A cage. No, she said. That ain't a request. Pike drew his pistol. Sadie moved. She was faster than any man his size. She was faster than Pike. Before he could raise the gun, she grabbed his wrist. She slammed his hand against the wooden stall. Hard. Eli heard a sharp crack, and Pike screamed. The pistol clattered to the floor. Pike yelled, clutching his broken wrist. Sadie didn't hesitate. She hit him. It was not a punch, but a flat-handed strike to the chest that sounded like a side of beef hitting a butcher's block. Pike flew backward, his feet leaving the floor, and crashed into a pile of hay. The wind knocked out of him. Gasping like a fish, Sadie scooped up the fallen pistol. Sadie, no! My God, no! Eli cried, his hands flying to his mouth. She turned to him, her face a mask of cold, desperate fury. She had the gun in her hand. They'll hang me, Eli, she said, her voice flat and certain. Or they'll lock me up till I rot. I ain't going in a cage. She strode to her horses, the paint and the buckskin. She threw her bedroll onto the paint and saddled it in 3 swift, practiced movements. Are you coming or not? She snapped. Eli stared at her, at the gun, at the groaning deputy. The town hated him. His father had disowned him. Mortimer had all but fired him. If he stayed, he was nothing. He was alone. He looked at her, this giant, violent, broken woman who had kissed him in the rain. He nodded. Get on the buckskin, she ordered, and hold the mane. I can't ride, he stammered. Not proper. You'll learn today. She grabbed him by the front of his shirt and, with one powerful arm, lifted and threw him onto the horse's bare back. He landed with a painful thud, grabbing the mane, his bad leg dangling uselessly. Pike was stirring, trying to get his wind back. Outside, shouts were rising. Someone had heard the commotion. Sadie mounted the paint, the pistol still in her hand. She kicked open the barn doors. A few men were running toward them. Sadie raised the pistol and fired one shot into the air. The sound was deafening. The crowd scattered. Screaming, "Go!" she yelled, and she brought her hand down hard, slapping the rump of Eli's buckskin. The horse bolted, terrified. Eli screamed, clinging to the mane for dear life. They shot out of the livery, Sadie right behind him, her paint thundering. They tore down the main street, scattering chickens and a barking dog. They galloped past the silent, staring faces of the townspeople, past the church, past Mortimer's store. They rode north, toward the high country, toward the wilderness. The ride was a blur of agony. Eli, unused to riding, was jostled and slammed against the horse's spine. His bad leg was a fire of pure pain. His spectacles were gone, lost in the barn. The world was a blurry, terrifying rush of brown and gray. They rode for hours, up into the foothills, where the dirt turned to rock and the air grew thin and cold. Sadie did not slow. She pushed the horses until they were lathered in sweat, their breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. By nightfall, Eli was done. He slid from the horse's back, his legs buckling, and collapsed onto the frozen ground. He could not move. He was shaking violently, sobs catching in his throat. "I can't," he gasped, his teeth chattering. "I can't. Just leave me." Sadie dismounted. Her face was grim, her eyes scanning the darkness. They were high up. The hills around them were dusted with the first snow of winter. In the distance, a wolf howled, a high, lonely sound that chilled Eli to his very bones. "Get up, Eli!" Her voice was hard. "I can't." She pulled him to his feet as if he weighed nothing. She half-dragged, half-carried him 20 yards to a shadow in the rocks. It was a shallow cave, barely an overhang, but it was out of the wind. She tethered the horses. She used her own bedroll and the one saddle blanket they had to make a nest on the cave's rocky floor. It wasn't enough. The cold was a living thing, a predator. Eli curled into a ball, shaking so hard he thought he would rattle apart. "We're going to freeze," he whispered. Sadie looked at him, his small, trembling form. She sighed, a long, weary sound. She sat on the blankets and pulled him down. She wrapped the meager coverings around them both. Then she pulled him against her. She locked her arms around him, pulling his back against her chest, cocooning him. He was small against her. Her body was a furnace. His head was tucked under her chin. Gradually, the violent shivering subsided. They were curled together, two outcasts, the wind screaming over the mouth of the cave. They lay in the dark for a long time. The only sounds were the wind, the stamp of the horses, and the distant wolves. "You shouldn't have come," Eli whispered, his voice muffled against her coat. "They'll hunt you for hitting the deputy, for taking me. They were going to lock me up anyway," she said, her voice a low rumble against his ear. "I told you, I ain't going in a cage. Eli, never again." What do you mean?" he asked. "You said that before." He felt her take a deep breath. Her heart, pressed against his back, beat a slow, heavy drum. "This ain't the first time I've run," she said, her voice flat and dead in the dark. "Back in Nebraska, I was working a ranch. The owner, a man named Calloway, a widower, he was a big man. Thought he owned everything, including the help." Eli went rigid in her arms. "He came to the bunkhouse one night, drunk, said I was unnatural, said he was going to find out if I was a woman or not. He tried to force himself on me." Eli squeezed his eyes shut. "I didn't let him," she continued, her voice hollow. "He grabbed me. I fought. He was strong, but I was stronger. I hit him. He fell back, hit his head on the stove. I broke his jaw. My God, Sadie." He told everyone I attacked him, that I was a brute, a liar, that I tried to force him. Who were they going to believe? Eli? Him, the rich rancher? Or the giant man-woman who worked his fields? She held him tighter, her arms trembling with a desperate, crushing strength. "They ran me out, put a bounty on me for assault. That's why I came here. So far west. Thought I could be quiet. Thought I could just mend fences." Her voice broke, just for a second. "But I'm just wrong." She buried her face in his hair. "I ain't going in a cage for that. Not for Calloway. Not for Jed Stokes. Not for any of them." Eli, his own face wet with tears he hadn't known he was crying, turned in her arms. He pressed his face against her chest, holding onto her. He was not afraid of her. He was not ashamed. He was just with her. And the wolves howled. They survived for 3 days on a handful of wild onions Eli had recognized from a botany primer and the last of the jerky from Sadie's saddlebag. The cold was a constant, physical presence, a third member of their party. Eli's limp, aggravated by the cold and the unaccustomed riding, had become a dragging agony. He rode when he had to, his face pale and set in a mask of pain, and walked when he could, his teeth chattering. On the fourth day, Sadie snared a rabbit. She had risen before dawn, a silent shadow, and disappeared into the pine scrub. Eli, waking alone in the meager bedroll, felt a moment of pure animal panic. But she returned an hour later, the rabbit hanging limp from her fist. She dispatched and cleaned it with a swift, economical violence that made Eli's stomach turn, but he was too hungry to look away for long. They roasted it over a small, nearly smokeless fire of dry pine, hidden in a cleft of rock. The smell of the cooking meat was maddening. They ate it with their hands, the hot grease dripping down their chins. It was the best meal Eli had ever had. That afternoon, a truce settled between them. The desperation eased, replaced by the simple, shared fact of survival. Eli, huddled by the fire for warmth, saw a long, jagged rip in Sadie's duster, torn during their flight from the barn. He said nothing, but he limped to the buckskin where she had strapped his small, water-damaged carpet bag. He fumbled inside, his fingers numb, and produced a small tin. Inside was a spool of black thread and 2 sharp needles. His mother, a practical woman before the sickness, had insisted all her children learn to mend. "A stitch in time saves 9, she would murmur, her voice already thin. He sat on a rock and threaded the needle, his hands shaking slightly, but his gaze focused. "Take it off," he said, his voice quiet. Sadie looked at him, then at the needle. She shrugged, her face unreadable, and slipped the heavy, stained duster from her shoulders. She was just in her shirt, and in the thin mountain air. He saw her shiver, but he saw, too, the coiled, bunched muscles of her shoulders and back, a landscape of pure, functional power. He took the coat. He turned it over in his hands, finding the rip, and he began to sew. He worked for nearly an hour. The stitch was small, tight, and perfect. A cross-stitch to bind the heavy canvas, then a double-lock stitch to finish it. He concentrated with the same fierce, quiet focus he had used on her hand in the store. This, at least, he could do. This was not weakness. This was mending. Sadie watched him. She did not speak. She watched his small, pale hands, the brows furrowed behind his cracked spectacles, the way his tongue darted out to wet his lips in concentration. He was a small, strange, broken man, and he was sewing her coat as if it were a wedding dress. He finished. He bit the thread, knotted it, and held it up. The seam was barely visible, a dark, clean scar. "It will hold," he said, his voice proud. She took the coat from him. She ran her large, calloused thumb over the stitches. He had not just closed the hole, he had reinforced it. She looked at him, and for a second, her face softened so much he thought she might smile. She did not. She just nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin, and put the coat back on. Later that evening, Eli was trying to find a comfortable way to sit, his leg throbbing, his walking stick, a flimsy piece of aspen he had picked up, was too short and offered little support. Sadie, who had been staring into the fire, stood up. She walked to a dense thicket of mountain mahogany, the wood hard as iron. She examined the branches. Then, with her knife, she cut a thick, straight limb. She brought it back to the fire. She did not ask his height or his grip. She measured him with her eyes. She began to carve. She worked as he had, with a quiet, patient focus. The knife blade, razor sharp, peeled back the bark, smoothed the knots, shaped the wood. She carved a notch for his hand, rounding the edges so they would not bite. She measured it against her own grip, then shaved it down. Knowing his was smaller, she carved until it was smooth, perfectly balanced and strong. She finished, and without a word, she held it out to him. Eli took it. The wood was still warm from her hands. He wrapped his fingers around the grip. It fit perfectly, as if he had been born to hold it. He stood up, putting his weight on it. The stick held firm, taking the strain from his hip, settling his balance. He looked at her, his throat thick. "Thank you. She just poked the fire with another stick. "It's just wood," she grunted. The next morning, she brought him the deputy's pistol. "You need to learn," she said. Her voice was flat. Eli recoiled as if she had offered him a snake. "No, I can't. I've never... My father..." "Your father ain't here," she said, her voice hard. "And those men from town are... or that bounty hunter... or others. I can't be awake every second. I can't be the only one who can fight. What if I'm hurt? What if I'm asleep? You'll let them take you, take me?" He stared at the gun. It was heavy, black, and smelled of oil and sulfur. It was a tool of damnation. I am not a violent man. Sadie, this ain't about being violent." She shoved the pistol into his hand. His fingers closed around it instinctively. It was heavy, far heavier than he'd imagined. "It's about living to see sundown. You think I like it? You think I like breaking men and running? It's just what has to be done." She took him 20 yards from the camp, to a clearing, and set a pine cone on a stump. "Point it, hold it with both hands. It'll kick. It'll kick hard enough to break your nose if you hold it wrong." He held it. His arms trembled. He was sweating. Though the air was cold, he was holding sin. "You flinch. You miss," she said, her voice in his ear, low and steady. "You flinch. You die. Don't think about the noise. Don't think about your father. Just look at the cone. Look at the one spot you want to hit and squeeze. Don't pull. Squeeze." He closed his eyes. "Open 'em, Eli," she commanded. "You can't shoot with your eyes closed." He opened them. He saw the cone. He saw his shaking hands. He pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The gun leaped in his hands. A brutal, jarring shock that ran up his arms and rattled his teeth. He cried out, dropping it, stumbling back. His ears rang. The smell of sulfur was thick in his throat. The pine cone was untouched. He was shaking from head to toe. I can't! Sadie picked up the pistol. She reloaded the spent chamber. She held it out to him again. "You can... I'm weak," he cried, tears of frustration and fear stinging his eyes. "I'm a cripple, a parson's boy. I'm not you." She grabbed the front of his shirt. She didn't shake him, but her grip was iron. She pulled him close, her face inches from his. "You ain't weak," she said, her voice a low, fierce growl. "You just never been allowed to fight. Your father put you in a cage your whole life. Eli, he told you that you were small and soft and broken, and you believed him. You stood up to Jed Stokes. You walked out of that store. You got on that horse. You ain't weak." She let go of him and shoved the gun back into his chest. "Now, pick it up and shoot the cone." He looked at her. He looked at the gun. He looked at the cone. He took a shaky breath. He picked up the pistol. He held it with both hands. He did not aim for the cone. He aimed for the tree next to it, a wider target. He squeezed. The explosion was just as loud, but this time, he was ready for it. He held on. He saw a small puff of bark fly from the tree. He had hit it. He lowered the gun, his arms aching, his heart pounding, but a strange, hot feeling spread through his chest. Sadie nodded. Again, they were filthy. For a week, they had not done more than wipe their faces with handfuls of snow. They smelled of wood smoke, sweat, horse, and fear. They found a stream, a fast, cold ribbon of water running through a narrow canyon, sheltered from the wind. The sun, bright in the thin mountain air, warmed the rocks. "We need to wash," Sadie said. "The smell of us will carry for a mile. It'll bring trackers or wolves." She began to unbutton her duster. Eli, his face instantly hot, turned his back. He heard the splash of water, the sharp, gasping breath as the cold hit her skin. He heard her washing, a vigorous, practical sound. He stood, his back to her, rigid with shame and a new, sharp awareness. "Your turn." He heard her come out of the water, the sound of her wringing out her shirt. He did not turn. "Eli." He turned. She was standing on the bank, dressed again, her hair dark and slick, water dripping from her face. "Go on," she said. He looked at the water. He looked at her. I'd rather not. We have to, both of us. You go on. I'll wait here." She read the shame on his face. It was as plain as the crack in his glasses. She understood. She did not mock him. She did not command him. She just stood on the bank, her form solid as the rock beside her, and she held out her hand, the same hand he had bandaged, the same hand that had held his in the barn. It was an invitation, a promise of safety. His heart hammered. He looked at her hand, strong and scarred. He looked at her face, her eyes steady. He was more afraid of this than he had been of the gun. Slowly, his hands shaking, he took her hand. Her grip was firm. He kept his eyes on her face as his clumsy, trembling fingers went to the buttons of his own shirt. He undressed. He was slow, agonizingly shy. He pulled off his shirt, revealing his pale, thin chest, his ribs like a bird's. He fumbled with his trousers, his bad leg making him awkward. He was scarred, not just his foot, which he kept hidden until the last, but his soul. He was ashamed of his weakness, his pale skin, his frail arms. He stood before her in the cold, bright air, naked. He could not look at her. He stared at the ground, at his club foot, twisted and small. He waited for the laugh, for the pity, for the look of disgust. Sadie did not look at his foot. She let go of his hand. She reached out, her fingers still cold from the stream. She did not touch his face. She did not touch his shoulder. She gently, her touch surprisingly light, laid her palm flat on his chest, right over his heart. He flinched, his breath catching. He could feel the calluses of her hand, the warmth of her skin, and the wild, frantic beating of his own heart against her palm. He looked up. She was not looking at his foot. She was looking at his face. Her eyes were not cold, or hard, or curious. They were soft, a word he never would have used for her. Soft and deep, and full of a quiet, aching understanding. "You ain't broken," she whispered. Her voice was rough. "You're just built different." He stared at her, his throat so tight he could not speak. She leaned in, and she kissed him. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the hayloft. It was not the clumsy, rain-chilled kiss in the barn. This was slow. It was warm. It was a discovery. Her lips were no longer chapped. They were soft, and they tasted of cold water and sunlight. He did not tremble with fear. He kissed her back. His hand, the one that had held the walking stick, came up and found her arm, her shoulder, her neck. He held on to her. The cold mountain air was on his skin, but he was burning from the inside out. They made love that afternoon, on the sun-warmed pine needles beside the stream. It was slow. It was careful. It was intense. For Eli, it was a revelation. He had been taught that this was an act of filth, a brutish sin his father preached against with spittle on his lips. But this was not filth. This was prayer. Sadie was gentle. Her strength, which he had only ever seen as a weapon, was now a shield. She was in control, but she was not dominant. She was careful. She held him, her large body sheltering his, and she guided him with a patience that shattered him. She, who had never known softness, was teaching it to him. He trembled the whole time, a storm of sensation and emotion. He was releasing a lifetime of shame, of being told his body was wrong, his foot was wrong, his desires were wrong. When it was over, he lay beside her, his face pressed into her shoulder, and he wept. He wept silently, his body shaking with sobs he had held back since he was a child. He was not afraid. He was not ashamed. He was undone. Sadie said nothing. She just held him. She stroked his hair, her rough fingers clumsy but tender. She wiped his tears with her thumb. He finally quieted. He looked up at her, his vision blurry, his heart so full it felt like it would burst from his chest. "You're the only thing that's ever felt good," he whispered, his voice broken. "The only thing, ever." She just kissed his forehead, a long press of her lips, and held him. That night, the world returned. They were asleep, curled in the bedroll together, his stick and her pistol beside them. The fire was down to red, pulsing embers. A single twig snapped in the darkness. Sadie was awake before the sound finished. She did not move, did not startle. She simply was. Her eyes opened. Her hand slid from Eli's back and found the grip of the pistol. Eli, sensing her tension, woke up. He saw her, a shadow in the moonlight, her body coiled, the gun aimed into the darkness. "Who's there?" she called. Her voice was not a woman's voice, or a man's. It was the low, dangerous growl of a bear. A figure stepped out from the trees, his hands raised, palms out. "Easy, girl, easy, just passing through, smelled your smoke." He was old, grizzled, with a long gray beard and a filthy sheepskin coat. A rifle was slung on his back, but his hands were high. "That's close enough," Sadie said, her voice like ice. The gun did not waver. "Figured as much." The old man's eyes were sharp. They took in Sadie, her size, the gun. They flicked to Eli, small and pale, sitting up in the bedroll. They lingered on the two horses, the paint and the buckskin. "You're Sadie," the man said. It wasn't a question. "The one from Nebraska, Calloway's woman." "I ain't his woman," she snarled. "Never said you were, just said you were his." The man spat a stream of tobacco juice. "There's still $100 on you for that jaw, and now," he nodded toward the valley they'd come from, "there's another 200 from Bighorn Flats. Assaulting a deputy, kidnapping a preacher's boy." Eli's blood ran cold. Kidnapping. They thought she had taken him. "You're here for the bounty," Sadie said, her voice flat. The old man laughed. A dry, wheezing cackle. "I'm old, girl. I ain't stupid. I'm one man. You're you. And you got that iron in your hand. And you look like you know how to use it. That $300 ain't worth the hole you'd put in me." He lowered his hands slowly. "I'm just gonna get on my mule and ride north. I ain't seen you, but word of advice, I'm not the only one looking. That 300 is a lot of money." He tipped his hat, a gesture of strange, professional courtesy, and vanished back into the shadows. They heard him mount, his mule's hooves clicking on the rock, fading into the distance. Sadie did not lower the gun for a long time. She was shaking, but with rage, not fear. "They're hunting us," she whispered. "They'll never stop." Eli, however, felt the fire from the gun lesson. He felt the warmth from her touch. He was not the same man who had fled Bighorn Flats. "Then we go somewhere new," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "We get lost. We go to a city." "And what?" Sadie finally lowered the pistol, her face bleak in the moonlight. "Me? Get work? People will still stare. They'll still whisper. And in a week, a month, some drunk will say the wrong word. And I'll be me. And we'll run again. There ain't no new for me. Eli." "No," Eli said, his mind racing. He was built to cipher. He was built to read. "We don't run. We fight. We fight my way." She looked at him. "I have a brother," Eli said, the idea forming, sharp and clear. "Thomas. He's in Denver. He's a lawyer. He's not like my father. Sadie. He's a good man. He believes in facts, in the law. The law is for men like Calloway," she spat. "Rich men." "Not Thomas. If I write to him, if I tell him what Calloway did, if I tell him what Jed Stokes did, he'll help us. He can file papers. He can do something." Sadie was silent. She distrusted this. This world of words and paper was not her world. It was a world that had only ever lied about her. "Please," Eli said. He took her hand, the one that wasn't holding the gun. "You taught me how to shoot. You carved me this stick. You held me. Let me do this. Let me try." She looked at their joined hands. She looked at his face, earnest and pleading in the firelight. She was so tired of running. She gave a single, reluctant nod. "All right, Eli, we'll try your way." The plan gave them purpose, but the mountains gave them a prison. The next day, The sky turned a flat, heavy gray, and then the snow began. It was not a gentle snow. It was a blizzard, a howling, blinding wall of white that descended on them, erasing the world. They were high up, exposed. The horses whinnied, turning their backs to the wind. "We'll die out here," Eli yelled over the roar of the wind. Sadie, her face a mask of snow, scanned the terrain. She grabbed the reins. "This way! There's a draw!" She led them, half blind, into a narrow fold in the rock. And there, built into the side of the hill, was a miracle. An old, abandoned line shack, used by ranchers during summer roundup. It was barely a cabin. The roof was half collapsed, the door gone, but it had 3.5 walls. They shoved the horses into the most sheltered corner, the animals huddling together for warmth. Sadie and Eli scrambled inside the tiny, dark space, which was barely big enough to lie down in. The storm raged. For 2 days, the world was nothing but white noise and biting, lethal cold. They were trapped, but they were together. They had the last of the rabbit, the blankets, and each other. They huddled, his back to her chest, just as they had that first night. Sharing every scrap of body heat, the tiny, ruined shack became their world. They were not running, they were not fighting. They were just being. They told stories, whispers in the roaring dark. Eli told her about his brother, Thomas, how he had always defended Eli from their father, how he had slipped him books. He told her about the love poem he had been caught reading. "What was it?" she murmured, her voice sleepy, her breath warm on his neck. It was by Mr. Keats," he whispered, blushing in the dark. "It said, 'Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art.' It was about wanting to be close to someone, forever." "Forever's a long time," she murmured. She told him about her mother, whom she'd never known, how her father had only ever said one thing about her. She was small. She told him about a stray dog she'd found when she was 10, a little brown terrier. She had hidden him in the woods, stealing scraps for him. Her father found him. He said a ranch had no place for a useless mouth. He shot the dog. Eli, listening, felt a hot, terrible anger. He twisted in her arms and held her. On the third morning, the wind stopped. The silence was as profound as the storm. A bright, cold sun lit a world that was buried in 4 feet of snow. They were alive. Eli, stiff, crawled out of the shack. The world was new, white, and dazzling. He took a deep breath of the clean, frozen air. He felt clean. Sadie emerged behind him, stretching, her tall frame unfolding in the bright light. She looked at the snow, at the blue, endless sky. Eli, filled with a strange, giddy relief, stooped, packed a handful of the light, powdery snow, and threw it at her. It hit her in the chest with a soft poof. She froze. She looked at the white mark on her duster. She looked at Eli, whose hand was still raised, his face a picture of, "Oh no, what have I done?" He started to stammer. I'm sorry, I just—" Her face, which had been stern, cracked. Her mouth quirked. A strange, rusty, unfamiliar sound came from her throat. She was laughing. It was not a giggle or a chuckle. It was a real, raw, deep laugh. A sound of pure, unadridden joy. It was the loudest, most beautiful sound Eli had ever heard. She scooped up a massive handful of snow, her hand the size of a shovel, and dumped it squarely on top of his head. He yelped, sputtering, the snow falling down his collar, and he laughed too. They stood in the bright, silent, snowbound world, 2 outcasts, laughing until tears ran down their faces, leaving tracks on their smoky, grimy cheeks. The descent from the mountain was a slow, walking agony. The blizzard had left the high passes choked with snow, and they were forced to lead the horses, plunging waist-deep into drifts, their lungs burning from the cold, thin air. Eli's carved walking stick was his anchor, saving him from falling 100 times. Sadie, her face grim and set, broke the trail, using her height and strength to stamp a path for him and the animals. They ate the last of their food, their hunger a dull, constant ache. But they had survived. They had laughed. The shared warmth of the ruined shack had forged something new between them, a bond tougher than the frozen ground. When they finally reached the lower, snow-free valleys, they were gaunt, ragged, and alive. They found a shallow, fast-running river and followed it south, away from Bighorn Flats, away from the life they had known. They came upon a town nestled in a dark fold of the hills, a place called Carbon Creek. It was not a town of homesteads and false-fronted stores like Bighorn. It was a mining town, a place of work and soot. A permanent gray haze hung over the cramped valley from the coke ovens, and the creek itself ran black with coal dust. The buildings were unpainted, functional, and ugly. The streets were filled with men with blackened faces and hacking coughs. It was perfect. It was a place where everyone was too tired or too busy to notice a stranger. A place where anonymity was the common currency. "We stop here," Sadie said, her voice rough. "We need money." And food. They had one thing of value: her horse, the paint, the animal that had carried her to Wyoming. She sold it at the livery, a grimy stable at the edge of town. She did not haggle, and she did not look the horse in the eye as the stableman handed her $30 in crumpled bills. It was a terrible price, but it was enough. That night, they rented a room, a tiny 8x10 shack of raw pine planking, perched precariously on a hill overlooking the slag heaps. It contained a narrow cot, a rusted pot-bellied stove, and a single crate for a table. It cost $1 a week. The first thing Sadie did was take her knife. She sat on the cot, gathered her long, dark hair in one fist, and sawed it off. The tangled locks fell to the floor, leaving a rough, hacked-off stubble. She looked like a sheared sheep. Eli watched, his throat tight. "Sadie, your hair, it's just hair." She took the remaining buckskin, the horse they had kept, and sold its saddle. With the money, she went out and returned with a heavy, second-hand mackinaw, a thick wool coat favored by the miners, and a flat cloth cap. She put them on. The coat was shapeless, hiding her figure, and the cap pulled low shaded her face. Her height remained, but she was no longer obviously a woman. She was just another large, rough-looking laborer, one of many who drifted through Carbon Creek. The next day, Eli went to find work. He put on his mended spectacles, his only suit coat, and took his carved walking stick. He felt the old, familiar shame, the dread of being judged. But then he felt the solid weight of the stick in his hand, a reminder of her strength. He walked with his head up. He found a job at a freight depot. The manager, a harassed man named Peters, was buried under a mountain of manifests and bills of lading. "You can cipher?" Peters asked, not even looking up. "Yes, sir," Eli said, his voice clear. "I can keep a ledger. Double entry. I write a clear hand." "And you won't steal from me?" "No, sir, I'm an honest man." "Fine, $10 a week. You start now." And so, their life began. It was a life of soot and hard work, but it was a life they had chosen. Eli would leave in the dark morning, his lunch pail in his hand, his stick tapping on the frozen mud. He would walk to the depot and spend 10 hours a day, his fingers stained with ink, bringing order to the chaos of the freight company's books. He was good at it. His mind, trained on scripture and poetry, found a strange peace in the logic of numbers. For the first time, he felt useful. Sadie took odd jobs. She shoveled coal from derailed cars. She mended fences for the mule company. She stacked lumber at the sawmill. Her strength was a commodity here. And as long as she wore her cap and her big coat, no one asked questions. She was just Sadie, the new hand, who didn't talk much but could outlift any two men at the yard. They lived in the tiny shack. They pushed the narrow cot against the wall, and it became their bed. They shared it, their bodies curled together against the cold, a tangle of limbs. Eli would wake in the night, his face pressed against her strong back, and feel a profound, terrifying peace. This, he knew, was home. They ate meals of beans and bread, sitting at the small crate in the evenings. Eli, his eyes aching, would read to her from a dime novel he had bought for a nickel, a story of a pirate captain. Sadie would sit on the floor, her back against the wall, mending his socks or sharpening her knife. She listened with a fierce, quiet intensity, her eyes on the rough planking. She had never been read to before. They were Mr. and Mrs. Miller. A lie they told the grocer, the landlord, the world. A lie that, in the privacy of their small, cold room, felt more true than anything either of them had ever known. Eli's mended spectacles were a problem. The crack, held by the sticky pine resin, was right in the center of his vision. He squinted constantly, and his head ached by the end of each day. He complained about it once, a passing murmur, and then fell silent, ashamed to be found weak. One evening, 3 weeks into their new life, Sadie came home late. Eli had the stove going, a thin stew bubbling. She had been paid for clearing a collapsed mine support. She walked in, her face dark with soot, and dropped a small, paper-wrapped parcel on the table. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it," she grunted, washing her face and hands in the basin. He carefully undid the string. Inside a simple wooden box was a new pair of spectacles, round, steel-rimmed, with clear, perfect glass. He gasped. They were expensive. They must have cost $5. "Sadie," he whispered, his voice trembling. "How? Where did you get the—" "Sold the deputy's pistol," she said, her back to him, drying her face on a rough towel. "Didn't need it. We got your brother. Your words." He stared at her. She had sold her only real defense. The gun she had used to save them. The gun she had taught him to use. She had traded it for his sight. He took off his cracked, mended glasses. He put on the new ones. The world leapt into sharp, clear focus. The grain of the wood on the table. The lines on his own hands. He looked at her. He truly saw her. Perhaps for the first time, the exact shade of her eyes, the flecks of green, the small, white scar on her temple, the fine lines of weariness around her mouth. She was beautiful. She was the most beautiful thing he had in his life. "Sadie," he said, and his voice was thick with tears. He went to her and put his arms around her waist, burying his face in her rough, coal-dusted shirt. He just held on. She stood stiffly for a moment, unused to the sudden embrace. Then, her large, work-roughened hand came up and settled on the back of his head, holding him. He had to give her something in return, something that was not a tool, something that was not for survival, something soft. He had no money, but he had his knife, and he had the scraps of mahogany left over from his walking stick. He worked at night by the low light of the lamp. After he thought she was asleep, he carved. He was not a carver, not like her, but his hands were patient. He carved a small, oval locket, no bigger than his thumb. He sanded it smooth with a piece of rough sandstone, over and over, until the wood glowed, warm and dark. He carved a simple, shallow S on the front. He made a tiny wooden hinge. Inside, he left a small, hollow space. He waited. He walked out by the polluted creek, far upstream, until the water ran clear. And there, pushing up through the half-frozen mud, he found them. The first flowers of spring, tiny, purple asters, tough and resilient. He picked 3, pressed them dry in his ledger for a day, and then, with delicate fingers, he fixed them inside the locket. He tied it on a simple rawhide lace. That night, he held it out to her. She was finishing her beans, her face weary. She stared at the small, wooden object in his palm. "What is it?" "It's a locket," he said, his face burning. I made it. For you." She took it. She turned it over in her massive, scarred hands. It looked like a child's toy. "It's just wood. Eli, open it." She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers too big for the tiny catch. He reached out and opened it for her. She saw the tiny, perfect, purple flowers inside. She stared. She looked from the flowers to his face and back. Her mouth opened slightly. She did not know what to say. No one had ever given her a flower. No one had ever given her anything that was not meant to be used. They're pretty, she whispered, her rough voice stumbling on the word. Turn around, he said. She did, her back to him. He moved her matted, hacked-off hair and tied the lace around her neck. The locket fell, dark and warm, against her skin. She reached up, her fingers closing over it, tucking it under her shirt. She did not take it off. Not ever. The piece lasted for 2 months. It was a cold, hard, working spring. But it was their spring. They were Mr. and Mrs. Miller of Carbon Creek. They were normal. And then, as it always must, the past returned. Eli was late at the depot. A freight train had derailed, and he was working feverishly to account for the lost cargo. Sadie, her own work done, decided to go to the company store for flour, but it was closed. The only place open that sold provisions after dark was the Black Nugget Saloon. She hated the saloon. It was loud, bright, and filled with men, but they needed flour. She pulled her cap low, hunched her shoulders inside her mackinaw, and went in. She kept her head down, walked straight to the bar, and waited. The saloon was thick with smoke, the twang of a bad piano, and the roar of men drinking away their pay. A sack of flour and a bottle of whiskey, she said, her voice a low grunt. Placing the coins on the wet bar, the bartender, busy, just nodded. She waited, and she felt it. A change in the air, a sudden quiet in the noise. The feeling she had felt her entire life. She was being watched. She did not turn. In a dark corner, 2 cowhands, drifted south from Wyoming, were playing cards. One of them looked up, annoyed by her height as she blocked his view. He looked again. He nudged his partner. Abel, he whispered. Look at the size of that. Fella. So? Abel grunted, staring at his cards. No, you look by the bar. By God, I think that's her. Abel looked. He saw the tall figure in the mackinaw. He saw the worn trousers. Then the bartender handed Sadie her things, and she turned. The light from the bar lamp fell on her face, under the brim of the cap. Holy Mother, Abel breathed. It's the giant, the one from Bighorn, Stokes's woman. The one who kidnapped the cripple? Sadie's eyes met theirs. She saw their faces. She recognized them. They were from the posse. They were from her flight. She froze. The saloon, for a moment, seemed to go silent. The men's faces were a mixture of shock, fear, and a sudden, greedy excitement. Sadie tucked the bottle in her coat, grabbed the flour sack, and turned. She did not run. She walked, her strides long and measured, through the crowd, which parted for her. She pushed open the saloon doors and disappeared into the night. That was her, one of them yelled. The $300 bounty. Sadie got back to the shack, her heart pounding. She slammed the door, barring it. What is it? Eli asked, looking up from his ledger. They're here, she said, her voice tight. Men from Bighorn. They saw me. They recognized me. Eli's blood went cold. Are you sure? I saw their faces. She was already pulling her mackinaw back on. We have to go, now. Eli, grab the bag. But our jobs, the shack is a box, she snarled, fear making her voice sharp. Our jobs are just words. They'll have the sheriff, or they'll come themselves. We have to go now. He was stuffing his ledger and his spectacles case into his carpet bag when the door crashed open. It was not the sheriff. It was the 2 cowhands, Abel and his friend, and a third man, a burly miner they had roped in with the promise of bounty money. They were drunk, and they were ready. There she is, Abel yelled, brandishing a knife. Grab the freak! We'll take her to the sheriff ourselves! Eli screamed, stumbling back, grabbing his heavy walking stick. Get out! Leave us alone! The third man, the miner, lunged for Eli. I'll take the cripple. You 2 get the woman. Sadie moved. She was not the clumsy giant of their stories. She was a cornered animal. She hit the miner, a flat-handed strike to his chest. He went down, his head cracking against the iron stove, and did not move. Abel slashed with his knife. He was fast. He caught her on the forearm. A long, deep slice. Sadie grunted, a sound of rage and pain. She kicked him in the stomach, a brutal, heavy-booted blow that sent him doubling over. The second cowhand, seeing his friends go down, his nerve broken, turned to run. Eli, in a cold, clear rage he had never known he possessed, did not let him. He was not the parson's boy. He was the man who had been taught to fight. He swung his mahogany stick, heavy as iron, with both hands, just as Sadie had taught him to hold the pistol. He brought it down on the man's knee. He heard the bone and cartilage tear. The man shrieked, a high, thin sound, and collapsed in the doorway. It was over in 10 seconds. The tiny shack was a wreck, filled with the groans of broken men. Sadie stood breathing hard, blood dripping from her arm onto the floor. "Eli," she panted, "the window." But it was too late. The shrieks had brought the town, and this time they had brought the law. The door, blocked by the groaning man, was shouldered open. The town sheriff, a man named Brody, stood there, his rifle leveled. Behind him were 2 deputies. He took in the scene. The 2 men on the floor, groaning. Eli, pale, holding a stick like a club, and Sadie, bleeding, her face a mask of fury. "Sadie," the sheriff said, his voice cold. He had the telegraph. He knew the name. "Known as Sadie, you are under arrest. Warrants from Nebraska. Warrants from Wyoming territory. For assault and for the kidnapping of Eli Miller." "He's lying," Eli shouted. "She didn't kidnap me. They attacked us. Look at her arm." "Put your hands up, Sadie," the sheriff ordered, ignoring Eli. Sadie looked at the 3 rifles. She looked at Eli. She looked at the blood on the floor. Her fight was gone. The weariness, the endless, crushing weight of her life settled back onto her shoulders. This was the cage. It had finally come. Slowly, she raised her hands. They took her. Eli ran after them, yelling, pleading. "It was self-defense. They broke into our home." "Tell it to the judge, son," the sheriff said, not unkindly. "These men claim you're a hostage." "I am not." They put her in the town jail, a squat, stone building with 1 barred window. Eli ran to the sheriff's office. "I want to pay her bail," he said, his hands shaking, pulling the few dollars they had from his pocket. The sheriff, Brody, looked at him with something like pity. "Son, there is no bail. Not on these charges. She's got a U.S. Marshal coming for her. She's wanted in 2 territories. I can't let her go." Eli was frantic. He was alone. He ran to the telegraph office. He spent the last of his money. A wire to his brother, Thomas in Denver. "Sadie arrested, Carbon Creek. False kidnapping charge. They will hang her. Help me, please, Eli." He waited. He knew a letter was faster than waiting for a wire back. He did the one thing he swore he never would. He wrote to his father. He poured everything onto the page. He wrote about Bighorn. He wrote about Calloway. He wrote about Jed Stokes. He wrote about the ambush in their shack. "She is not a beast. Father, she is a woman, and she is my wife in the eyes of God. They are lying. I beg you. Send money for a lawyer. Use your influence. They will kill her for crimes she did not commit. She is my life." He sent the letter. He sat outside the jail, on the cold ground, his back against the stone, and he waited. The reply from his father came 3 days later. It was delivered by the postman, a single, crisp envelope. Eli tore it open, his hands shaking. It was 1 sheet of paper, his father's cold, precise script. "You were warned against softness. You have chosen to lie with a beast, a creature of violence against God and man. You are no longer my son. You chose the beast. You will perish with it." Eli read the words. He read them again. A strange, cold calm settled over him. The last thread that bound him to his old life. The small, frightened boy who lived in fear of that voice snapped. He carefully folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and stood up. He was no longer Eli Miller. the parson's son. He was just Eli, and his place was here. He walked to the front of the jail. A small crowd had gathered, as they did every day, to stare at the man-woman who had kidnapped the cripple. They pointed and whispered. Eli, his new spectacles on his face, his carved stick in his hand, stepped up onto the boardwalk. He was shaking, but his voice was clear, and it carried. "You're all wrong," he shouted. The crowd went silent, turning to stare at him. "Her name is Sadie," he yelled, his voice cracking but gaining strength. "And she did not kidnap me. I went with her. I love her." A woman gasped. A man laughed. "He's bewitched." "She saved me," Eli continued, his voice ringing with a desperate, pure truth. "She was attacked in Bighorn Flats. A man named Jed Stokes tried to assault her. She fought back. In Nebraska, a rancher named Calloway tried to force himself on her. She broke his jaw to save her own honor. And last night, those men, they broke into our home. They tried to kill us for bounty money." He pointed at them with his stick. "She has only ever fought to protect herself. And to protect me. Is that a crime? To be strong? To fight back when cowards try to hurt you? Is that a sin?" The crowd was hostile. "She's a monster," one man yelled. "He's her puppet," another cried. A man stepped forward and spat, the glob landing on Eli's boot. Eli flinched, but he held his ground. He did not wipe it off. He looked at the man. "She is a better person, a braver person, than you will ever be." He saw, in the back of the crowd, a few faces, a miner, his wife. They were not yelling. They were listening. Their faces were troubled. They looked at Eli, this small, earnest man, and then at the jail, and they looked shaken. Sheriff Brody came out. "That's enough, son. Go home. You've had your say." Eli ignored him. He walked to the small, barred window. He could see her shadow in the darkness, standing close. He reached his hand through the bars, and her large, strong fingers found his. He pressed his face against the cold, damp stone. "Sadie," he whispered, his throat raw. "You should go. Eli." Her voice came from the dark, a rough, broken sound. "That letter, your brother. Go to him. Take the horse. Save yourself. This is my cage. It was always gonna end here." "No," Eli said. He gripped her fingers, lacing his own through them. He kissed her knuckles through the bars. His new spectacles, so clear, were blurred with his tears. "I am not weak," he whispered, a vow to her, to himself. "I am not leaving. My brother is coming. I am not going anywhere." Eli did not leave the jail. He slept on the cold boardwalk, his back against the stone wall, his carved walking stick across his knees. The first night, the townspeople who passed by sneered at him, the loyal pet waiting for its monstrous master. By the second night, they grew quieter. His speech had unsettled them. It was one thing to hunt a monster. It was another to hear a small, bookish man, a man they all knew as weak, speak with such clear, burning conviction. He was not a hostage. He was a husband. The miners' wives, the ones who had listened from the back of the crowd, began to leave him small offerings, a piece of bread, a cup of hot, bitter coffee. They did not speak to him, but they set the items on the boardwalk, just out of his reach. They were afraid of him, afraid of the line he had crossed, but they respected his vigil. He shared everything with Sadie. He would go to the small window, his fingers lacing with hers through the bars. "They brought coffee," he would whisper. "They just don't want a body freezing on their doorstep," she'd murmur back, but her voice was thick. He saw the sheriff, Brody, watching. He saw the lawman talking to the men Sadie had injured. Their stories, Eli noted, were getting louder, more confused. They had been ambushed. They claimed the giant and her pet had set a trap, but their eyes were shifty. The town was beginning to doubt. On the third day, a man arrived on the afternoon stage. He was not a miner. He was not a rancher. He wore a dark, clean wool suit, a city hat, and he carried a leather satchel. He was tall, like Eli, but where Eli was frail, this man was solid. He stepped down from the coach, looked at the sooty, grim town with an expression of profound distaste. And then, his eyes sharp, he saw Eli. He saw the disheveled clothes, the cracked spectacles, the walking stick, the weary, defiant posture. "Elijah?" the man asked. His voice was not like their father's. It was clear, resonant, and devoid of judgment. Eli stood up, his body stiff from the cold. He looked at the clean-shaven face, the familiar eyes. "Thomas!" Thomas Miller crossed the muddy street. He did not hug his brother. He just looked at him, his gaze taking in everything. "My God, Eli," he said, his voice low. "You look half dead, and you've grown a spine." "She didn't do it," Eli said, his voice raw. "She didn't kidnap me. They're lying." "I know," Thomas said. He gripped Eli's shoulder. "Your telegram was dramatic. I took the first train. They'll hang her. Thomas, they've got warrants from Nebraska." "That," Thomas said, his face hardening, his lawyer's mind taking over, "is what we are about to discuss. Where is the sheriff?" Sheriff Brody was not happy. He was in his office, chewing a cold cigar, when Thomas and Eli walked in. "Sheriff Brody," Thomas said, not waiting for an introduction. "I am Thomas Miller. I am an attorney from Denver, and I am here to represent both my brother, Elijah Miller, and Miss Sadie," Brody sighed, dropping his feet from the desk. "Mr. Miller, your brother is a victim. He's confused. My brother is a grown man." "Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice sharp and cold. "And he is the victim of the kidnapping. Since he is standing here, telling you he was not kidnapped, your Wyoming warrant is fraudulent. That's false imprisonment. Of both of them." Brody's eyes narrowed. "I've got other warrants. Assault on a deputy, aggravated assault on 3 citizens, and a prior. From Nebraska." "Let's start with Nebraska," Thomas said. He opened his leather satchel. "Your warrant is for the assault of a rancher named Calloway. I've been busy since Eli's wire. I have associates. I have here a sworn affidavit. Sheriff, not from Calloway, but from a man named Silas Green, a former hand on Calloway's ranch. It states that Calloway, 2 months ago, in a drunken rage, confessed to Mr. Green. He bragged about attempting to break in his new giant and how she ruined his face for it. He has since been accused by 2 other workers of similar abuses. Calloway's warrant, Sheriff, is a lie. It's the desperate act of a shamed man. It will not stand up in any territorial court, and you know it." Brody read the affidavit. His face grew grim. He had been played. "That still leaves the local charges," Brody said, his voice harder. "She broke Deputy Pike's wrist. She crippled a man's knee. Self-defense," Eli said, his voice clear and loud. He was not stuttering. Thomas held up a hand. "Let's review the facts. The men you're protecting were drunk. They were bounty hunting, which is a gray area of the law at best. They were not officers of the court. They broke down the door to my brother's private, rented home. Is that disputed?" Brody was silent. The lock on the shack's door had been shattered. "They entered his home, armed, with the intent to do violence and commit a kidnapping for profit. Miss Sadie and my brother defended themselves. She has a knife wound on her arm to prove it. My brother was attacked. The only assault here, Sheriff, was the one committed by those men. Or are you telling me that in Carbon Creek, a man doesn't have the right to defend his own home?" Brody was trapped. He was a lawman. And the law, as this Denver lawyer laid it out, was not on his side. He looked at Eli's fierce, intelligent face. He looked at the cold, hard affidavit. He was holding a woman on fraudulent warrants, and the only witnesses against her were the very men who had attacked her. He sighed, a long, weary sound of a man who was tired of this town, this soot, and this whole ugly affair. "She's a menace," Brody said, his last defense. "She's too strong. People are afraid." "That is not a crime, Sheriff," Thomas said. "Not even in Wyoming. Now, release her." Brody stared at Thomas for a long, hard moment. Then he grunted. pulled a heavy ring of keys from his belt, and walked out to the cells. Eli rushed to the window. He heard the metallic scrape of the key, the groan of the hinges. The cell door opened. Sadie stepped out into the hallway, blinking in the light. She looked at Eli. She looked at the tall, well-dressed stranger beside him. She walked into the office, her boots heavy on the floor. She was free. "Ma'am," Thomas said, tipping his hat. "Thomas Miller. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Eli speaks very highly of you." Sadie just stared at him, her mind unable to process. She looked at Eli, her eyes wide, questioning. He's my brother," Eli said, his voice thick. "He's a lawyer. It's over. Sadie, you're free." She did not cry. She did not smile. She just nodded. A single, slow acknowledgement. The cage was open, but the town was still a cage. When they walked out of the sheriff's office, the crowd was still there. They saw Sadie, not in chains. They saw Eli standing beside her. They saw the sheriff, his face like stone. "Turn and go back inside his office." The crowd did not cheer. They did not move. They just stared. A low, hostile murmur went through them. Abel, the cowhand, his arm in a sling, stood at the front. "You're letting her go," he yelled at the sheriff's closed door. "She's a monster. She's a killer." "She's free," Eli said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "The charges were false. Lies," the miner with the bandaged head shouted. "Lawyer's tricks. She ain't natural. She don't belong here." "Then we're leaving," Eli said. He took Sadie's hand. He did not care who saw. He laced his fingers through hers. He held his walking stick in his other hand. "We're leaving." He led her through the crowd. They parted for them, like the Red Sea, a wall of hatred and fear on either side. Men spat on the ground where she walked. Women pulled their children close. They got to their shack. It had been ransacked. The door was broken. Their few belongings were tossed. The stuffing from the cot's mattress pulled out. His ledgers were torn. His ink bottle smashed against the wall. Her mackinaw was gone, but the locket, which she had never taken off, was safe beneath her shirt. She stood in the middle of the ruin, her face empty. "It's not over," she whispered. "It's just a new room, a bigger cage. It'll just happen again." Thomas, who had followed them, stood in the doorway, his face grim. "She's right, Eli. They won't let you be." He looked at Sadie, his gaze one of clear, professional respect. "Ma'am, you are free, but you are not safe." "Not here." "I know," she said. "Come to Denver," Thomas urged. "Both of you. It's a city. You can get lost. I can find you work. Eli, you, Miss Sadie, I can find you a place. I can protect you, legally." Eli looked at Sadie. Denver. A city. A new life. Safety. Sadie looked at the ruined room. She looked at the clean, kind lawyer, and she shook her head. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice rough. "You're a good man. You're like him." She nodded at Eli. "But a city. It's just more people, more stairs, more folks to whisper, more saloons for trouble to find me. I can't." She turned to Eli. Her eyes were full of a terrible, quiet grief. She touched his face, her hand rough against his cheek. "You should go. Eli," she whispered. "Go with him. Go to Denver. Be a bookkeeper. Read your poems. Be safe. You deserve peace." She was letting him go. She was setting him free from the cage of her life. Eli looked at her. He looked at his brother. He saw the path Thomas offered, a return to the world of numbers, of quiet rooms, of safety, a life where he could be the parson's boy again, forgiven, redeemed by his respectable brother. He looked back at Sadie, her scarred, beautiful, strong face, her eyes, which had seen him, all of him, and had not looked away, the hands that had held him in the blizzard. "I have peace," Eli said. He took her hand, the one on his cheek, and he kissed her palm. He turned to his brother. "Thank you, Thomas, for my life, for her life. I will never forget this, but I can't go with you." Thomas studied his brother's face. He saw the frail, stuttering boy he had protected from their father was gone. In his place was a man who had faced down a mob, a man who had survived a blizzard, a man who knew, with absolute certainty, what he wanted. Thomas nodded, a slow, sad smile touching his lips. "I see." He reached into his suit coat. "You'll need this. Then—" He pressed a thick roll of bills into Eli's hand. "It's $500, my fee. For representing a new client. Go west. Eli, don't go to a city. Go to the high valleys. Go someplace where the sky is bigger than the people." Eli took the money. "I'll pay you back." "No, you won't," Thomas said. "Live well. That's the payment." He embraced his brother. A quick, hard hug. He tipped his hat once more to Sadie. "Ma'am, it was an honor." And then he was gone. They bought the buckskin back from the livery. With the money, they bought a second horse, a sturdy pack mule, and supplies: flour, bacon, coffee, ammunition, 2 heavy wool blankets, and a new coat for Sadie, a man's thick sheepskin duster, large enough to fit her shoulders. They packed the mule. They did not look back at the shack. They did not look at the town. Eli climbed onto the buckskin. He was no rider, but he was not the man who had screamed and clung to the mane. He sat the horse, his walking stick tied to the saddle, his back straight. Sadie mounted her new horse. She looked at him, her face under the shadow of her old hat. She was ready. They rode out of Carbon Creek. They rode west, toward the setting sun. He followed her to the edge of town, the last line of soot and slag. She stopped. She looked back at him. A final chance. "Eli, you don't have to do this. It's a hard life, and I'm hard." "You're my peace," he said. She stared at him for a long moment. Then, a small, slow smile, the one he had seen in the snow, touched her lips. She turned her horse west, and he rode beside her. 1 year later, they found their place. They had crossed the mountains, into the great empty basins of the high country. They found a valley, high up near the tree line, a place of granite, pine, and clear water. It was a place where you could see a man riding from 20 miles away. They built a cabin. It was small, sturdy, and built of logs Sadie had felled and hewn herself. Eli, with his mind for numbers, had made the joints fit perfectly. They had a stone fireplace, a real bed built from pine, and 2 chairs. They were not entirely alone. Down in the lower valleys, a few settlers, tough and quiet as the land itself, had started ranches. They learned of the strange couple in the high valley. They learned of the giant woman who lived with the bookman. But here, her strength was not a curse. It was a miracle. When a settler had a wild stallion, a horse that had killed one man and crippled another, he brought it to Sadie, and Sadie, with her quiet voice and her steady, iron hands, would gentle it. She broke horses. She was the best bronc buster in the territory. They paid her well, in cattle, flour, and coin. They respected her, as one respects a force of nature. And Eli had his books. Thomas sent them, crates of them, on the freight line. Poetry, history, science, philosophy. He ran a small library from his front room. The ranchers, starved for words, would ride up, and he would lend them books. He taught their children to read. He wrote their letters for them. He was the bookman, the one with the clear hand and the quiet voice. They were Mr. and Mrs. Miller, and here, in the high, clean air, the name fit. One night, the first heavy snow of their second winter began to fall. It was quiet, a thick, soft curtain blanketing the world. Inside the cabin, their fire burned steady and bright. The wolves, distant, howled at the moon. Eli sat by the fire, his new spectacles perched on his nose, reading a book of poetry. He was not reading of bright stars. He was reading about the sea. Sadie, who had been oiling a bridle, put her work down. She came and sat on the floor, her head resting against his knee. He put his book down, and his hand settled in her short, thick hair. They sat in silence, watching the flames. She turned, She looked up at him, her face soft in the firelight, the locket he had made her resting against her collarbone. She took his hand, the one that had held the book, and she kissed his palm. She kissed the ink stains on his fingers. "You ever think, Eli," she whispered, her voice a low, warm rumble, "that maybe we were just meant to be strange together?" He looked at her. He saw the giant who had terrified a town. He saw the woman who had cried in the dark. He saw the hands that could break a man or gentle a horse. He saw his wife. He smiled. He leaned down and pulled her close, his arms around her. He whispered against her hair, "I only ever wanted your kiss." Outside, the wolves howled, a long, lonely call in the vast, cold wild. Inside, their fire burned steady. Thank you so much for listening to our story. It means the world to us. We would be truly honored if you would leave a comment and let us know where in the world you are listening from. We'd love hearing from you. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, for more stories just like this one. And finally, please share your thoughts. What did you feel? What did this story make you think of? Your words are the fuel that keeps us writing. Thank you.